The S&P index is simply tracking the currency supply of US dollars for the past 100 years. As when you invest in a diversified portfolio of stocks, you're not making money. All you're doing is preserving the capital that you had. You're not getting poor. You're not getting richer. You're just tracking sideways. You think you're getting richer in nominal terms, but in real terms, you're not. And conventional economists would say they would say real economic growth or real asset growth should be calculated using the CPI. But of course, the CPI, you could reasonably conclude, is the lowest number that any self-respecting government-employed economist could possibly calculate. It is the rate at which an arbitrary portfolio of things the government thinks you should care about is going up in price. The true inflation rate, or I'd say the currency debasement rate, the monetary inflation rate, is the rate at which the supply of currency is increasing.
Right, and which would be about 7 to 10%.
That's 7 to 10%. Might even be more. I mean, you can actually trace over 100 years about 7%, but in the past 20, 30 years, it looks like more like 10% in US dollar terms. And weaker currencies, 14%. And the weakest currencies, 20 to 30% a year.
Do you think that's going to stop anytime soon?
No, it's impossible for it to stop, because governments everywhere in the world just spend more money than they take in taxes. And so the temptation is always just to print money to pay bills, either to fight wars, or to implement government policy. If I'm going to forgive student debt, if I'm going to fight a war, if I'm going to implement a medical policy, if I'm going to, pay a bureaucracy, I have to come up with money to do it.
How long is that sustainable for?
It depends on which currency you're printing.
I guess let's talk about the dollar.
Well, let's talk about ones that are simpler. Let's talk about El Salvador.
Okay.
If you have a small country and you print your currency and you get into a civil war, you print a lot of currency. Well, when you print that currency, the currency collapses. And so normally it's sustainable for about 4 to 8 years in the event of a real war. When does that happen in the U.S.? It happened in most colonies before the Revolutionary War. They all collapsed their currency every 40 years or so. It happened to the United States Continental Congress. Have you ever heard the phrase, it's not worth the Continental? During the Revolutionary War, the United States government printed its own money, greenbacks, and I think they just printed Continentals, and they expanded the currency supply by a factor of 200. And so the entire currency collapsed, and everybody that took those things was bankrupt by 1785 or something. So in the event of a war, your currency collapses pretty quickly. The losing side in World War I, the currency collapsed. And between 1914 and 1917, the currencies in France and the UK were about to collapse. The only thing that saved them was the U.S. entry into the war. So generally, in the event of a war, why do wars last 5 years? Because if the government's printing money as fast as they can, it takes about 5 years to suck all the economic energy out of the society. In the Civil War, the North printed greenbacks. They collapsed, and they were almost worth nothing by the end of the Civil War. The South printed their currency, that collapsed by the end of the war. So in wars, the currency can collapse in 5 years. If you take Argentina's collapsed their currency about every 20 or 25 years for the past 150 years. About 20 years.
Sure.
So the Argentine peso was 1 peso to the dollar about 25 years ago. It's 1,000 pesos to the dollar right now. So, you can see the same thing in Nigeria. So in a third tier currency, it'll last about, third tier currency, I would say a third tier currency is in a war. The currencies collapse in 5 to 10 years. Second tier currency, they collapse in about 20, 25 years. First tier currency, the world reserve currency is, say, the United States. Compare the United States, the dollar, compare it to the German currencies. The Germans have lost 2 wars, so their currencies collapsed like 3 times. How about the Japanese currency? It's collapsed, right? How about every other currency? The Russian currency. It's collapsed about 3 or 4 times. The last time it collapsed was 1998. Lebanon, it just collapsed a few years ago. U.S. won every war in the last 100 years. We are actually the strongest nation for the past 100 years. So we're the victor. We're the world reserve currency. So what has the U.S. dollar done? An acre of land in Miami Beach where I live cost $10,000 100 years ago. It cost $10 million today. Okay. Did the currency collapse? It's worth 0.1%, right? It lost 99.9% of its value. So, in fact, that's the winner, right? And how long will that go on? How long can it go on? I mean, at 7%, you can presumably do it another 30, 40, 50 years, something like that. But the world reserve currency goes to the end. It'll last until the mercantile empire fails. Where you see the fraying on the edges is you see the collapse of the Sri Lankan currency. You see the collapse of every currency in Africa, the collapse of the currency in Nigeria, the collapse of the currencies in Lebanon, the collapse of or the weakening of currencies in Turkey. You see that right now. Turkish lira has fallen by 75% against the dollar in the last 36 months. Generally, the biggest risk is in the second tier, third tier country. In a third tier country, your currency's broken, right? So what do? Normally, you actually just flip to the dollar. That's why is there so much demand for tether, right? Stable coins. If you live in Argentina, you live in Nigeria, you live anywhere in Africa, it's like the dollar looks like a pretty good idea. Everybody knows what the dollar is. If your currency's falling 30% a year and the dollar is only falling in value 7% a year, it looks like the dollar is gaining, right? Whatever. 20, 25% a year.
Right.
Because your currency, your economic system is so relatively weak. So what you have is a whole world that goes through this currency collapse. Is this new? No, it's not new. If you read the history of the world, go read, there's 15,000 pages of Durant's Story of Civilization. I read it for fun. I reread it for fun. There's thousands of stories of an empire rising. The first king conquers, the son maintains. The third one in the line comes along and decides to overreach, overspend, debases the currency, bleeds the people dry, eventually can't pay the military and it collapses. And what happens is they always blame it on the barbarians. It's like the bad people that live next door, they abused us. But what really happens is every single empire in the past 10,000 years that we've got a recorded history on, they go through this dynamic of they're weak and virtuous. They struggle. They rise against another adversary. The big, strong empire becomes fat, dumb, happy. It becomes corrupted from within. The Roman Empire, the French Empire, the Russians, the whatever, fill in the blank. And after the empire becomes corrupted within it, collapses, the new empire rises, it stays virtuous for some amount of time. It might be 50 years, it might be 100 years, it might be 200 years. Eventually it becomes corrupted, it collapses. And this is just the story of civilization.